My father died in a car crash on his way to meet his mistress, and what I found in his secret apartment changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The man I respected my entire life had been living a double life for 15 years, funding two complete families without either one knowing about the other. When the police handed me the keys to an apartment I'd never heard of, I thought there had been some mistake. But inside that apartment, I found family photos of my father with three children who looked exactly like me, a woman who called him husband, and evidence of a life so complete that I realized I might have been the secret, not her. Yesterday, I discovered he left behind more than just debts. He left behind three half-siblings who don't even know he's dead, and a choice that will destroy innocent lives no matter what I decide. Before I tell you about the most shocking family secret you'll ever hear, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. This story gets darker than you can imagine, and I need to know you're ready for what's coming, because this isn't just about betrayal. It's about inheritance, revenge, and the choice between protecting innocent children or saving my mother from financial ruin. Comment below. What would you do if you discovered your dead parent had an entire second family that inherited everything while your family got nothing? Because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything about loyalty, forgiveness, and what we owe to people who never asked to be born into our family's lives. The decision I had to make in the next 48 hours would either destroy 4 innocent lives or condemn my mother to poverty and homelessness. I'm 32 years old, and my father was supposed to be my hero, a successful construction contractor, married to my mother for 28 years, who always preached about family values and keeping your word. He worked constantly, often leaving at 5 a.m. and coming home after 9 p.m. But I admired his work ethic and dedication to providing for our family. My mother never questioned his long hours because the money was good, and he always said he was building our future with every job he took. But when the police called me to identify his body at the morgue, they mentioned he was driving toward an address I'd never heard of, an apartment complex 20 minutes from our house where, according to the lease agreement in his wallet, he'd been paying rent for over a decade. The landlord casually mentioned that the landlord said my father was a great tenant, very reliable, lived there with his wife and kids. And that's when my world started crashing down. The apartment key was in his pocket, along with a phone I'd never seen before with a bright pink case covered in little girl stickers. When I powered on that phone, the first message I saw was from someone named Maria saying, "The kids are asking when Daddy is coming home. Miguel has a fever and Sophia needs help with her math homework." 3 kids. 3 kids who thought my father was his full-time dad, just like I always believed I was his only child. The phone had hundreds of photos, birthday parties I'd never seen, Christmas mornings in a house I'd never visited, school plays and soccer games where my father cheered from the sidelines for children who shared his smile in his eyes. The most recent photo was from last week, my father helping a little boy who looked exactly like I did at age 8 build a treehouse in a backyard that wasn't ours. Maria Santos, 38 years old, was my father's other wife for 15 years, and from every piece of evidence in that apartment, she had no idea he was married to my mother. In her world, he was David Martinez, a traveling construction contractor who spent half his time managing job sites in other cities, but always came home to his real family. He had 3 children with him, Carlos, 14, Sophia, 12, and little Miguel, 8, and they all carried our last name legally, Martinez. The apartment was filled with school awards, family vacation photos, and a normalcy that made my stomach turn because it was so genuine. On the refrigerator, there was a note in my father's handwriting. "Maria, took the kids to school, left your coffee ready, love you always, David." The same man who forgot my mother's birthday 3 years in a row had been leaving love notes for another woman. Going through his secret papers was like discovering a parallel universe where my father was actually present, involved, and loving. 2 mortgages, 2 car payments, 2 sets of school tuition, 2 families' worth of medical insurance, birthday parties, Christmas presents, and everyday expenses. He'd been supporting both households by working 16-hour days, taking on dangerous, high-paying jobs, and borrowing money from loan sharks when legitimate credit ran out. The debt was staggering, over $300,000 spread across credit cards, private lenders, and advance payments from clients that he'd already spent on both families. But what made it worse was seeing how much more involved he'd been with Maria's children than he'd ever been with me. Homework help schedules, soccer practice calendars, and detailed notes about each child's needs and personality. When I told my mother what I'd found, she collapsed on our kitchen floor and sobbed for 20 minutes straight. I knew something was wrong, she whispered, staring at the family photos I'd brought from the apartment. He was never here anymore, always working late, always exhausted, always distant when he was home. She'd been married to a ghost for years, wondering why her husband seemed so emotionally unavailable and physically absent. I thought he was just working hard for our retirement, she said, holding a photo of my father teaching Miguel to ride a bike. But he was working hard to afford a double life, and I was the one he was hiding from. The betrayal in her eyes was devastating because she realized that every work trip, every late night, every weekend job had been time he was spending being the father and husband to another family that he'd never been to us. But the real shock came when I found his will, properly notarized and legally binding, hidden in his secret apartment's desk drawer. He'd left everything to Maria and her children. Our family home, his construction business, his life insurance policy, his truck, even the savings account my mother thought was for their retirement. My mother and I were mentioned only as recipients of his debts and obligations. According to this document, Maria Santos was his legal wife. He'd somehow managed a second marriage without divorcing my mother, and Carlos, Sofia, and Miguel were his only recognized children and heirs. The will was dated 3 years ago, meaning he'd made the conscious decision to financially abandon the family he'd had for 29 years in favor of the family he'd created in secret. My mother, who'd worked part-time jobs her entire marriage to support his business expenses, was left with nothing but the crushing debt he'd accumulated trying to maintain 2 lives. I had 2 choices that would define what kind of person I really was. Destroy this woman and her innocent children by revealing the truth about their devoted father, or protect them while watching my own mother lose everything she'd worked for her entire adult life. Maria was calling my father's phone constantly, begging David to come home because Miguel was sick and Sofia was asking why Daddy hadn't called her back. Every message broke my heart because these children genuinely loved the man who'd abandoned me emotionally years ago. But simultaneously, my mother was facing foreclosure on our family home, bankruptcy from the debts she never knew existed, and the complete destruction of everything she'd believed about her marriage. The legal reality was that Maria's family would inherit everything, while my mother would inherit only debt and betrayal, and I had less than 48 hours to decide whether to fight this injustice or accept it to protect innocent children who'd done nothing wrong, except be born to my father's lies. I spent the first night after the funeral sitting in that secret apartment, reading my father's journals and trying to understand how a man could compartmentalize his life so completely. He wrote about both families with equal love and devotion, but it was clear that Maria's household had become his real life, while my mother and I had become the obligation he fulfilled out of duty. Carlos is getting so good at baseball, reminds me of myself at his age, read one entry, while the next said, need to remember to call home, haven't talked to my son in 2 weeks. The journal revealed that he'd been planning to divorce my mother and legitimize his relationship with Maria, but he'd been waiting for me to graduate college and get established in my career. He'd been slowly transferring assets to Maria's name for 3 years, preparing to abandon us officially while making it look like business decisions. The final entry, written the day before he died, said, "Tomorrow I tell Maria the truth about everything. She deserves to know she's not the secret anymore. They are." The investigation I did into my father's finances revealed the staggering extent of his deception and the impossible situation he created. He'd been taking construction jobs in cash to avoid taxes, then splitting the money between both households while borrowing against future work to cover the shortfalls. Maria thought he made $80,000 a year and spent half his time traveling for work, while my mother thought he made $120,000 a year and worked locally with occasional out-of-town jobs. The reality was he'd been making nearly $200,000 annually, but spending $250,000 to maintain both lives, covering the difference with increasingly dangerous loans from people who don't accept bankruptcy as an excuse.
3 different loan sharks had been calling his secret phone, demanding payments on advances he'd taken for jobs he'd never be able to complete now that he was dead. The mathematical impossibility of his situation meant that even if I combined both families' resources, we couldn't pay off his debts, but splitting them meant guaranteed financial destruction for whoever didn't get the assets.
When I finally worked up the courage to drive to Maria's house, I sat in my car for an hour watching my half-siblings play in their front yard. Carlos was teaching Sofia some basketball moves while little Miguel chased their dog around the garden. And their laughter was heartbreaking because they had no idea their world was about to collapse. Maria appeared at the front door, scanning the street hopefully, clearly waiting for my father to come home from his business trip. She was beautiful in a way that made me understand why my father had fallen for her. But more than that, she looked like someone who'd never been lied to, never been betrayed, never had to question whether the person she loved was real. These children had grown up with a father who attended every school event, helped with homework every night, and tucked them into bed with stories and kisses. They had had the father I'd always wanted, and destroying their memory of him felt like murdering their childhood. But letting them keep their illusions meant accepting that my mother would lose everything she'd sacrificed for a marriage that was apparently meaningless to the man she'd devoted her life to. The phone calls from Maria became more desperate each day, and listening to her voicemails was torture. "David, please call me back. The kids are worried and I'm scared something happened to you," she'd sob into the phone. "Miguel keeps asking when you're coming home and I don't know what to tell him." She'd called his boss, his friends, even the police to report him missing. But since she knew him by a different last name and had no legal proof of their relationship, they couldn't help her. Meanwhile, my mother was dealing with lawyers, creditors, and funeral arrangements while trying to understand how her entire life had been a lie. "I keep thinking about all the times he said he loved me," she told me, and wondering if he ever meant it or if I was just the practice family before he found his real one. The contrast between Maria's desperate love and my mother's devastated resignation was killing me, because both women deserved better than the choice my father had forced on all of us. I realized that whatever decision I made would create a ripple effect of pain that would last for generations. If I told Maria the truth, her children would grow up knowing their father was a fraud, their family was built on lies, and their inheritance was stolen from another family. Carlos was already 14, old enough to understand that everything he'd believed about his father was false, old enough to hate himself for loving a man who'd abandoned other children to be with him. Sofia would blame herself for being happy when another woman was suffering, and little Miguel would lose his hero and his security in one devastating conversation. But if I stayed silent, my mother would lose her home, her savings, her future, and her dignity, while I watched another family benefit from her sacrifice. The legal system would side with Maria because she had the marriage certificate, the will, and the documented relationship, but morally, she was benefiting from a crime she didn't know she'd participated in. 3 days after the funeral, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to Maria's house, knocked on her door, and introduced myself as David Martinez's son from his previous relationship. "I have some difficult news about David," I told her, watching her face change as she realized her husband had been keeping secrets. "He was in an accident, and he's gone." Her scream could be heard 3 houses away, and Carlos came running to hold his mother while she collapsed with grief. I held her while she cried, this woman I should have hated, because her pain was real and her love had been real, even if my father's honesty hadn't been. "There are some legal complications with his estate," I explained gently, "but I want you to know that I'm going to make sure you and the children are taken care of." In that moment, I chose to protect the innocent rather than punish the unknowing, even though it meant sacrificing my mother's financial security. The plan I developed over the next week was complicated, but felt like the only moral choice available. I would contest the will on behalf of my mother, not to destroy Maria's family, but to force a fair division of assets that could support both households while managing the debt responsibly. I hired a lawyer who specialized in bigamy cases and discovered that my father's second marriage was actually illegal, which meant the will could be challenged successfully. But instead of using this information to crush Maria, I proposed a settlement that would give both families enough to survive. Maria would keep the apartment and half the life insurance, while my mother would keep our family home and the other half. The business assets would be sold to pay down the debt, and both families would work together to manage the remaining obligations. It wasn't perfect, and both families would have to dramatically reduce their standard of living, but it meant Maria's children could stay in their school district and my mother wouldn't become homeless in her 60s.
When I explained the situation to Maria, sitting at her kitchen table while her children did homework in the next room, she listened with a dignity that made me understand why my father had loved her. "I never knew about your mother," she said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "He told me he'd been married before, but that he was divorced. That you were from a previous relationship, but you lived with your mother by choice." She'd been lied to as completely as we had, manipulated into believing she was his fresh start rather than his secret. "I can't take everything from your mother," she said, "but I also can't tell my children that their father was a fraud. They've lost him already. They don't need to lose their memory of him too." Her willingness to sacrifice financially to protect everyone involved, including the woman she'd unknowingly replaced, showed me a strength and character that my father had never deserved. We agreed to tell her children that David had financial complications from his previous marriage that required sharing the inheritance, which was true enough to avoid destroying their image of their father. The settlement negotiations took 3 months, during which both families lived in financial limbo and emotional uncertainty. My mother struggled with depression and rage, alternating between wanting to destroy Maria and feeling guilty for hating an innocent woman. "She gave him the family he actually wanted," my mother would say on her bad days. "I gave him duty and obligation. She gave him joy and presence." But on her good days, she'd acknowledge that Maria had been as much a victim as she was. "That woman lost her husband just like I did. Her children lost their father just like you did. The only difference is she got the best parts of him while I got the exhausted leftovers." Maria, meanwhile, was dealing with 3 grieving children who couldn't understand why their inheritance was complicated or why they couldn't afford the same lifestyle anymore. Carlos, the oldest, began to suspect there was more to the story, asking pointed questions about why his father had so many work trips and why certain family friends seemed surprised to learn about his death. The financial reality of my father's double life created challenges that extended far beyond the initial inheritance dispute. Both families had been living above their means, subsidized by his increasingly desperate borrowing and the unsustainable pace of his work schedule. Maria's children were enrolled in expensive private schools, participated in costly extracurricular activities, and lived in a neighborhood that required 2 car payments and high property taxes. My mother had been planning retirement based on assets that didn't actually exist and insurance policies that were split between beneficiaries she didn't know about. The debt consolidation process revealed that my father had been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years, taking cash advances from one credit card to make minimum payments on another, borrowing against the business to cover household expenses, and promising future work to cover present spending. Even with the settlement agreement, both families would need to make dramatic lifestyle changes, sell possessions, and find additional income streams to avoid bankruptcy. 6 months after my father's death, I found myself in the surreal position of co-parenting financial decisions with my father's secret wife while trying to help my mother rebuild her life from scratch. Maria and I talked weekly about expenses, school costs, and managing the remaining debt payments, creating a relationship that was both necessary and incredibly awkward. Her children knew me as Carlos's older brother from Daddy's first marriage, which was close enough to the truth to be comfortable for everyone involved. Miguel had attached himself to me as a male role model, asking me to help him with the treehouse project my father had started, while Sophia sought advice about school and friends that she'd previously shared with her father. Carlos, now 15, had figured out more of the truth than we'd told him, but had chosen to protect his younger siblings from the full reality. "I know Dad wasn't perfect," he told me one day while we worked on homework together, "but he loved us all, didn't he?" The question broke my heart because the answer was both yes and no, and neither response would help him process his grief.
My mother's healing process was complicated by the daily reminders that another family was mourning the same man, but with completely different memories. She'd started therapy to deal with the betrayal and depression, but every interaction with Maria brought up fresh waves of anger and sadness. I see how those children loved him, and I remember when you used to look at him that way, before he started disappearing into his work. The realization that my father had been present and engaged with Maria's children while becoming increasingly distant from us added another layer of pain to her grief. She'd lost not just her husband, but her understanding of who he had been as a person and what their marriage had meant. I don't know if I should hate him for lying or hate myself for not being enough to keep him interested. But I watched that woman struggle with 3 children and a broken heart, and I can't bring myself to hate her for getting the love I couldn't hold on to.
1 year after my father's death, the 2 families that he'd created in secret had become an unlikely extended family, bound together by shared trauma and mutual necessity. Maria's children called my mother Abuela Rosa and had started joining us for major holidays, creating new traditions that honored their father's memory while acknowledging the complexity of his choices. My mother had found purpose in helping Maria navigate single parenthood and financial management, sharing decades of experience in stretching budgets and managing household crises. "I raised 1 child while married to a ghost," she told Maria one Christmas evening while we watched all the children play together. "You're raising 3 children as a single mother with half the resources I had. We might as well help each other." The relationship wasn't without tension and difficult moments, but it had evolved into something resembling genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience. The business implications of settling my father's estate revealed just how precarious his financial juggling act had become, and how many people had been affected by his deception. His construction company owed money to suppliers, subcontractors, and clients while depending on new projects to pay for previous work. Without him there to maintain the complex scheduling and relationship management that kept everything running, the business collapsed within 6 months. 12 employees lost their jobs. 3 families lost deposits on home renovations that would never be completed. And 2 suppliers had to write off substantial unpaid invoices. The ripple effect of his double life expanded far beyond our 2 families, to include everyone who depended on his work, his promises, and his carefully maintained reputation. Maria and I spent months calling clients, returning deposits, and helping find other contractors to complete unfinished projects, trying to preserve what little remained of his professional reputation while managing the legal and financial fallout. 2 years later, I can see how my father's death and the choices that followed changed everyone in ways that are still unfolding. Maria has become a stronger, more independent person, building a career in accounting that allows her to support her family without relying on anyone else's promises or presence. She's also become someone who values honesty above comfort, teaching her children that integrity matters more than convenience or avoiding difficult conversations. My mother has emerged from her depression with a clearer sense of her own worth and identity, no longer defining herself as half of a marriage, but as a complete person who deserves genuine love and respect. She started dating again, carefully and with full disclosure, determined never to be anyone's secret or second choice. The children have grown up faster than they should have, learning that adults can make terrible mistakes and that love doesn't always come with honesty. But they've also learned that families can be created through choice and commitment, rather than just biology and marriage certificates. The most unexpected outcome of this entire nightmare has been the relationship that developed between me and my half-siblings, who have become some of the most important people in my life. Carlos is now 17 and planning for college, but he still calls me when he needs advice about girls, career choices, or just wants to talk through problems with someone who understands the complexity of loving and hating the same person. Sophia, at 15, has developed into a thoughtful young woman who writes poetry about complicated families and has taught me more about forgiveness than any therapy could. Miguel, now 11, still sees me as the big brother who helped him finish his treehouse and taught him to drive a stick shift in empty parking lots. But he's also become someone who asks deep questions about truth, loyalty, and what makes a family real.
These relationships have given me the experience of being a big brother and a father figure that I never expected to want. And they've shown me that my father's greatest legacy might be the connections between people he never intended to bring together. Looking back, I realized that my father's death forced all of us to choose between perpetuating cycles of abandonment and revenge or creating something new from the wreckage of his deception. I could have destroyed Maria and her children to punish them for my father's choices, but that would have made me complicit in the same kind of selfishness that created this mess in the first place. My mother could have spent the rest of her life bitter and closed off, using her betrayal as an excuse to never trust or love again. But instead she chose to build relationships with people who shared her pain and understand her experience. Maria could have raised her children to hate their father's first family, teaching them that love is a zero-sum game where someone always has to lose. But instead she chose to model forgiveness and integration. The children could have grown up angry, divided, and suspicious of adult promises, but instead they've learned that families can be chosen and rebuilt, that mistakes don't have to define relationships, and that it's possible to love someone while acknowledging their failures.
The financial settlement that seemed so important in those first desperate months after the funeral has become almost irrelevant compared to the relationships that grew from our shared crisis. Both families are living more modest lifestyles than before, but with greater honesty, stronger connections, and clearer priorities about what matters most. Maria's house isn't as fancy as the apartment my father had been paying for, but it's filled with laughter, homework help, and family dinners where everyone actually wants to be present. My mother's retirement isn't as comfortable as she'd planned, but she's surrounded by grandchildren who adore her, a friend who understands her history, and a sense of purpose that comes from helping raise the next generation with better values than their grandfather demonstrated. The money my father left behind was built on lies and unsustainable debt, but the family structure we've created from his wreckage is built on choice, honesty, and mutual support, even when it's more difficult than the alternatives. The family gatherings we have now include conversations about his mistakes, acknowledgement of the pain he caused, and ongoing efforts to model better communication and relationship skills for the next generation. Carlos talks openly about his father's flaws while still honoring the good memories. Sophia writes poetry that processes complex emotions rather than hiding them. And Miguel is growing up in a household where adult emotions and financial realities are discussed honestly, rather than hidden behind false promises and artificial stability. If someone had told me 4 years ago that my father's secret family would become some of my closest relationships, that my mother would consider my father's mistress one of her best friends, and that our combined households would create holidays, traditions, and support systems that feel more genuine than anything from my childhood, I would have thought they were insane. But grief, necessity, and conscious choice have created something that my father never could have built with all his lies and financial juggling: a family structure based on truth, mutual respect, and shared commitment to doing better than the generation before us. His death revealed the ultimate betrayal, but our response to that betrayal has become the foundation for relationships that will outlast the pain he caused and the debts he left behind.
The most important lesson from this entire experience is that inheritance isn't just about money and property. It's about patterns, choices, and the decision to either repeat destructive family cycles or break them for the sake of future generations. My father inherited patterns of emotional unavailability and dishonesty from his own family, and instead of breaking those cycles, he amplified them by creating elaborate deceptions that hurt everyone who loved him. But his death gave the rest of us the opportunity to choose differently, to build relationships based on honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, mutual support, even when it's inconvenient, and forgiveness, even when it's undeserved. The children in both families are growing up with a different understanding of what family means, what love requires, and what kinds of choices create lasting relationships versus temporary happiness built on unsustainable lies. Now, when people ask me about forgiveness and whether I've forgiven my father for the chaos he created, I tell them that forgiveness isn't about pardoning his choices or pretending they didn't cause lasting damage. It's about choosing not to let his mistakes define the rest of our lives or dictate how we treat each other going forward.
Maria has forgiven him not because his deception was acceptable, but because staying angry would poison her relationship with her children and prevent her from building genuine connections with people who understand her experience. My mother has forgiven him not because his abandonment was justified, but because choosing bitterness would rob her of the joy she's found in her relationships with her step-grandchildren and her unexpected friendship with Maria. The children have forgiven him because they're too young to carry that kind of anger and too wise to let one person's failures convince them that all adults are untrustworthy. What would you do if you inherited not just debts and property, but the broken relationships and unresolved conflicts that someone else's choices created? Would you choose justice or mercy, revenge or integration, separation or the difficult work of building something new from damaged pieces? Because that's the real inheritance that comes with betrayal and death, not the money or possessions, but the choice between perpetuating cycles of pain or breaking them to create something better for the people who will come after us. Hit that subscribe button if this story made you think about your own family patterns and what you'd choose to inherit versus what you'd choose to leave behind.